Hey, Maru.
Hey, Torin. Glad you could join us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I'm not, I saw your comment. Well, I guess we should probably wait for other people. Um, I'm definitely interested in hearing more, though, about how to separate sort of policy enforcement from developer intent.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I was trying to maybe mirror what we already had in the annotation-based mechanism, but maybe that wasn't really ideal. So
Yeah, I don't know about like the trade-offs for like annotations versus like top level like specific fields versus like a separate resource. I think that's like from my perspective, the policy engine should be able to work with any of those, those methods, and I think OPA can today. So I'm not, I don't have too many opinions about that. But yeah, I'm happy to chat about like where the policy should be defined and like and I just yeah my main question was just around like what the goal was of that that part of the proposal basically like what's the problem that we're trying to solve.
Hey, Darren, how's it going?
Hey Quentin, good. How are you?
Splendid. I see your stuff is steaming ahead in the CNCF. Oh, you froze.
Yeah, it's going ahead. I think there's a vote sometime soon.
Cool, but I want you to wrap that at 80 columns, please, Torren.
I would be happy to wrap it. However, Chris was the one that opened the PR, and so I can't actually change that.
I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah, Sarah's cool. We've chatted with her before.
Okay.
Yeah. It did bother me when I looked at the file. I was like, oh God, come on.
But it's not like they're endless lines. They're like 92 instead of 80 or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, who are we still waiting for? I think Shashi was on his way. Is Paul planning on joining us?
Paul he's still in London at a OpenShift Commons event, so I don't think so.
Oh, okay. And congratulations to Red Hat for acquiring CoreOS. That's pretty exciting.
I mean, I'm just a peon, so it was as surprising to me as everyone else. Yeah, that seems like a good fit.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Cool. Well, in that case, is Irfan? Oh, there's Irfan. No, he's not. That's Shashi. I can never make out these small little face print things. Is Irfan joining us, Shashi? Do you know?
I think he should probably join.
There we go. He just arrived. Awesome. Looks like we have the prime suspects all in the room.
Cool.
Maru, do you want to drive things, or who's going to?
Sure. I think one of the most important things that we need to discuss is the role of policy in this, because I was kind of naively trying to sort of integrate what we had sort of as an annotation-based mechanism into this API proposal. And I think Torin had some concerns, and it kind of made me wonder whether I really understood how policy was, like what its purpose was, whether the existing implementation represented like an ideal, like we're just going to annotate things and provide a per resource indication of what should happen, or should there be something else?
No, I mean, Torin can talk to it in more detail. My perception is we just kind of hacked something quick and reasonably dirty together to illustrate the principle, but it wasn't really designed in any detailed way. I mean, I think Torin, you knocked that together in a couple of weeks at most, from what I recall. So yeah, I think we can certainly step back and say, how should policy fit in here better?
Too much work into the. Sorry, I'm on a hotel Wi-Fi. That's not great. I was just echoing kind of what you were saying, but yeah, we should chat about that more for sure.
Yeah.
I think the overarching question for me is, what's the relationship of policy as implemented by OPA and things like RBAC, or other like cube sort of native security mechanisms. And also, I mean, it seems you had some concern about the language that we were using, or like the selector mechanism. I've kind of just assumed selectors are kind of a cube native thing that people would understand. I understand that they're limited, and I guess I was expecting that someone would be able to define placement via like selectors, which are like a low-hanging fruit type of solution. And if they needed something more complicated, they would step to policy. But I was naively assuming that policy would sort of just translate into something like selectors. And from your comments, maybe that's not the case, and maybe you could elaborate on why.
Sure. Yeah. Do we want to just dive into this now, or do we want to cover other things in the meeting? I don't want to monopolize I don't know what the format of this call is supposed to be.
Yeah, I think what I would personally like to get out of this meeting is some concrete stuff that people can go off and start submitting PRs. And I've got a few kind of ideas, but maybe Irfan has others as well, and Maru. So I'd like to make sure we get there at least. Maybe we can time box a policy discussion to make sure that doesn't sit in the back burner for too long. Happy to chat about it for 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever.
Okay, so let's take the next 10 minutes or so to chat about the placement policy stuff, and then we can move on to other topics. Okay, so I guess, so Maru, you asked one question, which was what's the relationship of RBAC policy or authorization policy and placement policy, and how OPA fits into that picture. And so just to address that, because that's kind of a high level thing, OPA is basically designed to allow you to enforce different kinds of policies throughout your system at different layers of the stack. And so what it gives you is this policy language that you can use to encode rules about how the system should behave, that isn't coupled to any particular project or layer of the stack or domain or anything like that. Okay, so you can use it to enforce authorization policies if you want. You can use it to enforce placement policies. You can use it for admission control policies. There's all kinds of different applications for it. So it's meant to be general as well as other projects. So I don't think we need to talk about RBAC right now, because that's a totally separate topic. So I would rather just focus on placement policy. Does that make sense to you, Maru?
I think so. The reason I was bringing up RBAC is having placement be on a resource versus it's a separate resource would allow an ACL to be enforced via RBAC.
Sure.
But if we're talking about an admission controller that's using OPA or something that's more specific, then maybe you don't want to use RBAC. Maybe you could apply you can't change this field. What I was concerned about was if there was an administrative policy that said replica sets with these characteristics need to go here, to these clusters. If it's selector based, or if it's just field based and there's no protection on the fields that are being set, then someone can go in and override the policy. So there has to be a way of determining what the policy should be and then making sure that it's enforced, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that I think that access control over the policies themselves is interesting, but it's sort of I would imagine it's kind of out of scope to some extent. Today in Federation, I don't know what it's called now, Federation 1.0 or whatever. That in that model, you load the placement policies as config maps, and you could enforce access controls over those config maps today. If you wanted to be able to control who can touch the policy.
But there's kind of two parts. There's who can touch the policy, but then there's I've decided what the placement for a given resource is. Should that be, anybody should be able to change that, or should that also be restricted to the same set of users who are defining the policy?
Are you asking whether specific developers should be allowed to request certain, to specify certain pieces of intent at all? Is that what you're asking? Today in 1.0, the user would deploy an application, and they would say this application requires PCI compliant clusters, or it would require EU jurisdiction or something like that, right? And so that would be specified by annotations or labels or whatever, or other fields in the manifest. like pieces of intent to control what they can specify?
It's more that if, okay, so in your specific example, if I had a replica set that said, I require PCI compliant clusters, like some way of indicating that, and the policy interpreted that and said, well, then you should be placed in these clusters. And it would put that placement information, like in the current iteration, it would put it into the annotation specifying like cluster selector, or the cluster selector. And the question was, who should be able to change that cluster selector once it's been set by the policy engine? Should it be anybody? Should it be restricted to a subset of users that are privileged to do so?
Whoever gets the access to that particular object, in my opinion, it should be the case like that, right? So, for example, user has created a replica set in a particular namespace, and he has access to only that namespace, and he can access that replica set. Then that user would be able to update or change it also.
Right, but that's the way
That's
it is.
exactly what policy is intended to not allow. So policy might say, you know, you're user X and you don't get to actually choose which clusters you go in. We choose for you. You can, you know, give us some basic requirements that you need PCI or you need this or that, but you can't actually choose where to put your stuff because we decide which clusters you go into based on costing and whatever policy might apply. So I think that's the key thing, is that the person creating the resources is kind of intentionally different than the person creating the policy. And the person creating the resources fundamentally has different permissions than the thing enforcing the policy. And I think if I can paraphrase Maru's question, how do we actually like implement that? How do we make sure that the policy engine can execute policy decisions and get through the necessary RBAC rules that may be in place to execute that, but not allow the creator of the resource to be able to do the same thing. And I think we can, I mean, I would suggest we sort of time box this somewhere on here. I think we do need to solve that problem. I don't think it's like a fundamental problem. I think it may, so there are a couple of different ways of thinking about it. None of them, I think, massively affect the design overall. The one is field-based RBAC, where, and I know we don't have that yet, and I know we want that, etc. But the basic idea that, you know, certain fields can be set by the policy enforcement engine, and certain fields can be set by the user, and those may be disjoint. And the other one is to have kind of a whole bunch of these constellation of I don't know what a general term we've mentioned for, I don't know if we've given a general term, but we've got overrides, and we've got placement, and we've got propagation, we've got all of these things which are looking like they're a sort of constellation of resources around a primary resource that needs to go into one or more clusters. And by appropriately factoring those, we can say, well, you know, some of these are accessible to the policy enforcement engine, which may, for example, determine which clusters it goes into, or may even propagate it into the clusters. And some of them are accessible to the user who wants the resource, you know, federated. And you may even have like some kind of a multiple inheritance sort of override thing where, you know, what the policy decides overrides what the user asked for.
I think we can probably take this offline. It sounds like there needs to be a more involved discussion. The reason I was kind of concerned that we discuss this as soon as possible is that I think there is kind of a problem with the existing, like with the proposed way of using selectors. Because if you want to protect like what a policy applies to, say I want to have these, you know, I want to say these resources go into these clusters, the selector is like a weak association, because if you can change the labels or whatever other, like the fields that the selectors are targeting, then you effectively change the policy application, or you can.
Yeah.
So it's more difficult to apply it. And so I just wanted to make sure we were aware of that, so we didn't pick a design that precluded enforcing policy.
Yeah, Maru, that's a good point that you bring up, and I think that I think that at a high level, like Quinn was saying earlier, that we did this work really quickly in 1.0, but I think that at a high level, the decision that was made to decouple like the placement decision logic from the actual like enforcement was like a really good one, and I think that that's a good model going forward because it allows anybody to plug in their own placement logic that they want. If they want to use something off the shelf like OPA, they can, but they can also build their own, or we can provide a default one or whatever. But just having that decoupling that exists today, I think is a good design pattern there.
Yeah.
So that was my main thing that I wanted to understand within the proposal, because in the proposal, it looks like that decoupling was going away, and we were going to be left with this federated placement object that contains a miniature DSL for describing how workloads should be placed onto clusters, and that was the kind of core point that I was trying to understand. So happy to have a follow-up conversation to go into this in more detail.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
As a brief aside, before we leave this topic completely, I'm trying to remember exactly what context this came. I think it was in the context of multi-tenancy, actually. There was similar problems related to, interaction with resources by multiple tenants, and how limited it was, and whether namespaces were the right abstraction, and how isolated namespaces were, and all that kind of thing. And it sort of has a lot of commonality with the problem we're facing here. And one thought I had there, and I haven't turned it into a full design proposal, but I think it's got quite a lot of potential, is to actually elevate labels to like first-class objects. So labels are owned by somebody, and you can apply RBAC rules to them, and you can say this person can read that label, and this person can write that label, and this person can attach that label to this thing. And then many of these problems become much more tractable, I think. So I could take that. It's basically a comment in the side of a document somewhere, a very long comment, but I could turn that into a kind of design proposal if we think that might help us solve this problem.
Is that something that would be specific to Federation, or would that be something?
No, the proposal was that it would be a general mechanism for solving this class of problem. And it was basically a couple of, so one thing was like first-class labels, which you could apply RBAC to, and the other one was having them hierarchical. So you could, apply rules, RBAC rules to kind of hierarchies of labels. So you can say anything that's a sub-label of this thing, is not readable by these people. And it turns out to be a reasonably powerful model. But I need to write it down in sort of more detail. I'm sure it'll be ripped to shreds by other people as soon as I write it down, but it seems worth writing down anyway, even if we get the objections to it formalized in a set of comments.
It sounds interesting. I definitely have some concerns about that model, but the problem it's trying to solve.
Doesn't surprise me at all, Maru.
What's that?
I said that doesn't surprise me at all.
I guess I just have unanswered questions, but at the same time, it's like the problem that you're trying to address is definitely one that we have, and whether it's implemented something first class, which has the quality of being able to be manageable via RBAC, versus some kind of admission controller mechanism, which is arbitrarily configured. Like, I definitely would prefer the first class thing. I'm just worried about how complicated it might make things. But I'm interested.
My hope is that it might be simple, but I'd have to write down the details to convince people of that.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely something that would help here.
And this probably overlaps, I'm guessing, with a lot of problems you run into all the time. So I don't know if you would be interested.
Yeah, I'd love to be part of that conversation, I think.
Prime review. Does it sound completely insane to you, or does it sound like it's worth writing down?
I think it sounds like it's worth writing down. I mean, I think that as soon as you start trying to express rules over like arbitrary collections of labels that are possibly nested, it begs for a general solution. So, can
you label your labels though? That is the question.
I think my only caution is that like to focus on the problem. Like labels, first class labels is one solution, but the real problem is we need a way of like making selectors like strong associations, like that they can't just be wiggled out of by changing labels by anybody. To me, that's at least one problem to solve. And so as long as you're clear in the problem statement, I think putting that down on paper gives people an opportunity to explore that solution, but also consider other solutions to
Yeah, absolutely.
problem. So
we have this problem all over the place in Kubernetes.
Okay, so Maru, will you set up a follow-up discussion just on the placement?
yes, I think we've had like a Monday meeting that we've been using for discussion. Maybe we could try to use that time slot again if that works for people. What time zone are you in, Torin?
Pacific.
Okay, so would like 9:30 Monday be possible?
Yep. Would this be next week?
Yeah.
Yep, that should be fine.
Okay, I will schedule a meeting then.
Cool.
I guess I'll need help because I don't actually know how to schedule meetings on the Cube calendar, but I'm sure Irfan can help me.
Okay, I'll do
So
that.
just to be clear, are we talking about policy? Is that a policy discussion?
Sorry, say again?
Well, the Monday meeting, was that to kind of explore policy integration with Federation more deeply? Okay, I'll see if I can knock out that document before Monday and maybe it'll be useful.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, while you guys were talking, I was trying to look for somehow on top of my mind, I thought there has been a proposal somebody did bring up for field level access control in KTS, but I couldn't directly find any. Is there any that you have heard of? Either, I mean, anybody, maybe Quinton?
Yeah, I have heard rumors that there's need for field level RBAC, but I don't think it's implemented, and I think there are a bunch of problems associated with it. But beyond that, I don't know. I'd have to dig around. I think there's some documentation around it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, let's move ahead then. The last meeting, when we were off the last meeting, I think we were at the discussion around placement. So one thing was concluded that we keep placement, like Torrent was also saying right now, that we keep placement logic decoupled from the actual object. And currently whatever is proposed in the document, it seems to be right. Is there any other concern about what is what the problem statement that we are talking about around that? Or we move on to the next section or next part, which would be propagation, I guess.
No, I think we're heading in the right direction. One brief kind of thought I had, and I won't take more than 30 seconds here. I would like us to just bear in mind like what the baseline is for like ease of use, which I think is the current system. You know, you can just take a normal familiar Kubernetes object and you can create it and it works. And you can then, it works to some extent, and then you can incrementally, by at the moment applying annotations, you can influence where it gets placed and some other things. Now it has limitations and nobody's claiming it's great, but I think that's kind of like a baseline for ease of use. And I think we should try and make sure that we always score whatever other proposals we have against that baseline, just to make sure we don't diverge too far away and end up with something which is like massively more difficult to use than the baseline. And then now I'll be quiet.
Is there a specific concern, like a fear you have, like a solution?
Well, yeah, I guess the sort of thing that made it cross my mind was right now we've got propagation, we've got cluster, I forget all the terms. We've got status, we've got propagation, we've got placement. We sort of have some sort of templating, although that's more placement and weighting and all of that stuff. So we have, a fairly substantial subset of what's spoken about here implemented, and it's relatively straightforward to use. And in the simplest case, you can actually just create a Kubernetes resource, and it does default weighting and default propagation and et cetera, et cetera. And if in order to get that sort of behavior with a new system, you end up having to create like 7 different things and apply labels to tie them all together and make sure that they all are hooked up together properly, then if that is substantially more difficult to use than the current system, then I think we should figure out how to solve that problem.
That's fair. I think the example we're seeing here, we're talking about 5 distinct resources, which isn't 7, but it's still a lot. And that is like template, override, placement, status, and scheduling. And I can imagine that, I think it's useful to have them separate for sort of experimentation purposes, to be able to easily kind of, compose basically things out of different pieces. But I think it's likely that anything that is tied directly to a resource, like overrides, I've been kind of implementing overrides, and I'm like, well, this is kind of annoying. I implement it as a separate resource, and then I have to have a relationship between the 2 things, and I have to make sure there's a policy to remove one if one's deleted or not, or and it just, So I mean, to me, overrides is probably the biggest candidate for merging and having that just be part of the template resource. Placement, I think that there's advantages to having placement separate that we discussed last meeting. So at least in the near term,
just to be clear, I don't have any objections to the advantages of disconnecting these things. I just want to make sure that we don't get too carried away with factorization and then up with a very difficult to use system. And then I guess related to that concern is we can always argue that, but you can just create a layer above this thing and hide all of these, complex relationships and separate objects by creating a sort of a different higher level abstraction which ties them all together. But if that is the case, then in order to use that higher level abstraction, you have to have all of the underlying stuff anyway. And it has to be, specific versions and specific controllers and things that do all the right stuff. In which case, why did you make them all so pluggable in the first place if all you did was build a layer on top of them and you need all of the plugins to be precisely as defined by the higher level layer? Maybe you've just kind of created a whole lot of... Anyway, that was just a thought. As long as we keep that in mind and don't end up accidentally at a place where people have to create 5 resources where they previously created 1 to do something reasonably straightforward.
So I should say that I'm pretty allergic to complexity, which means I have a mild allergic reaction whenever I'm touching Cube. But
okay, good.
In terms of the implementation, it's I think the only way that you could create what you're talking about is if you didn't have to implement it. And anybody who actually has to implement a bunch of different resources and deal with all the complexity of it's not simple to create APIs in Cube, even with generators. So to my mind, it's going through this process, I'm immediately oh man, having override separate sucks. We should merge that. And I'm sure that, that'll probably be true for scheduling too.
But again, just to be very clear, I'm way more worried about the user's experience than about the developer's experience.
Right, but I'm saying that they're, for better or worse, to me, they're tied together. If I'm having these things separate, I'm adding a lot of complexity, more work for me, and it correlates to more work for the user. I'm just trying to say there's a correlation, which I think is a good thing, because it prevents the sort of sprawl that you're talking about. I definitely am concerned about the user experience too. I mean, I want this to be simple. I think that's, as you say, the existing solution sets a bar. And if we go too far beyond that, we're going to be harming ourselves.
Well, even that bar is actually considered difficult. I mean, people struggle to understand how federation works and get their heads around it, even with the very simple API we have at the moment. So I would argue that we really can't afford to go any worse than that, because things are just going to get way worse. But anyway, and the same goes for configuration. I mean, or rather deployment. Right now we have, a controller manager and an API server and you deploy them into a cluster, and people can't even get that right. If we now have them having to deploy, a dozen of these different controllers to make stuff work, makes me nervous. Anyway, let's move on.
That's what automation is for. I mean, I kind of agree with you. Having like my sort of experimentation, just vendoring cluster registry is kind of painful today, and integrating like aggregation is going to be painful, at least initially. Like we'll automate it, make it friendly for the user, but we're moving from deploy API server and controller manager. We're moving from that to, deploy and aggregate cluster registry potentially if it's not already deployed, and deploy and aggregate like the API server and deploy the controller manager. So we're already looking at like a more complicated world. And the goal is just going to be to automate that and hide it from the user as much as possible. Like, yes, if there's some sort of problem, but by default, they shouldn't have any more work than they do today.
Yeah.
Guys, I did not interrupt you in between, but I think we have been talking about the functional areas, these 5 things that we are talking about. They have been, I was corrected upon this when I assumed that these 5 are going to be 5 different resources. So we haven't concluded that we are going to have 5 different resources, right? So, so far we have only concluded that we will have a federated object vis-a-vis Kubernetes object, and probably a placement object separate from it. We can talk about the rest of them and see where they fit.
I'm not sure at least for me, I'm not deciding on a specific representation beyond like the base object. And I think the goal is just sort of being able to weigh the pros and cons, like what's the cost both to user experience and developer overhead to having things separate versus combined. And sometimes in the case of placement, like there's actually a functional reason to have it separate, as you say. We may or may not have that be true of any of the other resources.
Can I just ask a question about the placement thing? So, like, how do you envision like a dynamic placement decision being made in this new model? Like, it seems like you need to have these placement resources like created in advance before the workload is actually deployed. And so I could imagine a solution to this, but it seems kind of like complicated. And so I'm wondering what you have in mind. Like, how would you enforce a placement decision that's dynamic in nature in the model?
By dynamic, you mean something which takes the feedback from the system, like which actually falls into the scheduling category, or you mean
there's 2 separate things.
Yeah.
Just anything a function of the input. So like if you have a replica set coming in, and you want to make a placement decision based on some field in that some arbitrary field in that replica set, or based on external context, for example, that maybe not in the replica set, it's changing externally. Like how would you achieve that with this proposal?
Are you talking about like a policy engine deciding placement? Or are you talking about like the dynamic scheduling? Because I think like if there's a resource that needs to be created, like versus a field you could just set, and you just be responsible for creating, like a policy engine would be responsible for creating the resource and setting the appropriate field. It's
okay.
Yeah.
So let me just echo this back to make sure I understand. So like a request to deploy a replica set comes in, and there's like a dynamic placement decision that needs to be made, and the policy engine would go ahead and basically create on the fly one of these placement objects that would select the created and enforce the desired placement policies.
I guess the question, or what you're saying, raises the question for me: if the policy engine needs to be able to make a decision about placement and provide a placement directive to the propagator, where does it do it? And in the existing model, the object that it's deciding policy for has a field and it's just set. Yep. And if we have a placement resource that is somehow using a selector, well, how do you know there's not already a placement decision being made by somebody? And how do you Like there's no authoritative place to put the decision, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Which I think, I mean, not that I think this is important. I'm just like, maybe this is just part of the policy discussion. Like maybe there needs to be a different,
but I think it's
two types of resource where one is like specific to the object and one is like can.
I don't know how specific it is to placement. I think this would apply to any of these things like overrides or like scheduling.
Well, overrides are separate though, and so is scheduling. They have to be tied directly to the resource. At least okay. Overrides, I think it makes sense to. I mean, you could have it differently, but I mean, overrides have to be typed and they have to have a reference to what they're applying to. And so essentially it's like just extracting the fields and allowing some variation, but placement.
Okay. That's not split up. Okay.
Yeah.
But just I hope I'm using the correct terminology here. So a user specifies they want a bunch of stuff, and that includes like placement directives, like I would like to be placed in Europe or Asia or whatever, and they specify what the template of their thing looks like. And they specify that certain overrides should take place. For example, when you put stuff in Asia, you should substitute give it the Asian database or whatever it happens to be. But then there's actual controllers doing this stuff. So there's some logic somewhere that's choosing with or without the input of policy to decide like which Asian cluster to choose, and that's got to be like decided somewhere and externalized somehow, because there's potentially a different thing that has now got to propagate that thing into the Asian cluster. And there's yet another thing that has to make the correct substitutions into the template, given that we've decided to put it in cluster X. And so I think that's what Torin's asking is who actually does each of those steps, and where are how do they communicate with each other, and how are they sequenced together in the right way so the end result is correct? Was that?
Yeah, I mean, like this. Yeah, sequencing is another question that immediately comes to mind. I think a lot of these things today fit into like into an admission controller today, right? But this proposal is sort of splitting all those things out into separate resources, and that's
well, it's not actually in the mission controller. It's so the way the policy integration with OPA was done, it is implemented as an admission controller and basically changes what the user specified and turns it into a more specific set of placement decisions. And then the rest of the engine says, oh, the user, it's as if the user chose the clusters they wanted to go into rather than saying they wanted a PCI compliant cluster. And then, it does all of the propagation and weighting and everything else. So I don't think admission control is actually inherent or necessarily directly relevant to the problem. The problem is there are all these different stages that need to happen to get something to the end. And how do they tie together and how do they pass information from one stage to the other is the question.
Yeah, and I think one point that is important in Torin's question is the sequencing of these things. So for example, one thought which came after his question is, say we have to enforce a placement directive, and I think that is discussed in the document also. If it's not one particular placement directive or object is not tightly coupled with one particular object, a federated object, you could have multiple of them also. Then who exactly takes this decision and at what time? For example, a controller, we leave it to a controller, or we leave it to admission controller, or whichever controller. Some entity will take this decision, maybe take an intersection of multiple directives or make union of them or whichever way, and enforce it into the system some way, modify the object or update the labels or selectors or something to do. And if we leave the similar possibility with other resources also, for example, overrides or for example, scheduling. For example, you can have multiple scheduling directives or scheduling policies applicable on the same resource, then it seems like we are making this problem space more complicated. I think we maybe need to simplify that.
I'm not sure where you're extrapolating that we would want multiple scheduling policies for a given resource. The scheduling preferences example in the document is a direct object reference. And I guess the idea would be is you wouldn't necessarily want to have, like maybe you would enforce it by, I don't know, you could have an admission controller that says you can have only one. But I guess I'm saying...
The example that comes to my mind is something... hello?
Keep going.
Yeah, we can see. Still hearing.
Yeah. Yeah, the example that comes to my mind is that, for example, currently, if you see Federation, there is some overlap between the scheduling of replica set based on the weights or whatever annotations are applied, and something which is fed back from the system, for example, matrices in case of HBA. So this is just an example of two possible scheduling policies enforced on the same object, right? So I'm going, I mean, I was thinking on that lines. What I'm saying is we should probably avoid doing this. We should probably have direct, even if we have information kept in different resources, we should ideally have direct or close coupling with object, with the particular object.
I think that's reasonable. Yeah. I mean, the kind of pipeline I had in my head was you would have, a template, you'd have overrides, you would have placement, and those were kind of the things that would drive propagation. And then if you had a scheduling mechanism, it would actually influence either in memory or stored, to etcd. I'm not being specific about that, but it would, effectively change the overrides or change the placement as required. Does that make sense, Quentin?
I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I'd have to see it concretely kind of.
I mean, I guess like the idea for me,
major objections, but yeah, I guess who gets to make the final decision, I guess, is interesting if you've got different things. One doing one set of overrides, another one doing another set of overrides.
I guess I wasn't imagining that there would be which overrides are you talking about? I only imagine there being one set for a given resource. Where would there be a second one coming from?
Well, it gets back to the sequencing stuff, and maybe I should give it some more thought before talking too much, but I mean, you either have to do substitutions into the template before you do placement, in which case placement can be based on template substitutions, or you have to do template substitutions after you do placement, because maybe, for example, the template substitutions need input from the placement decision, like which cluster the thing went into, or which.
Why would that? I guess if your question is like, I could imagine like for a given resource, it would be a question of like, which clusters do I go into, which to me implies placement. And then for each cluster, you take the template and you would apply the cluster-specific overrides to derive the cluster-specific resource definition, and then propagate or ensure that that was propagated to the correct location in that cluster.
Yeah, that sounds fine. And that is this ordering. So you kind of have this workflow, strictly ordered workflow by which that happens. That's fine.
I was going to say, but doesn't scheduling also feed into, like, for the example here is like the replica count is affected in scheduling. And so that's, after template overrides have been applied, I guess?
No, I think the argument was before. So the overrides happen after that, but yes.
The overrides happen before or after scheduling?
After.
I thought the overrides are more like static and the scheduling is more dynamic.
Well, that's a good question, though. I mean, the way that we've been considering, or I've been considering this anyway, has been overrides are overrides. If the user specifies overrides, but there's this dynamic scheduling component that's going to say set replica count. The scheduling value just supersedes the user value. By enabling scheduling, they're implicitly enabling that behavior.
Yeah, that's what I understood of the design. So that's where I think we have this notion of like two different overrides in a sense.
But the open question is whether a scheduling decision for replica count is just written into the overrides and actually serialized to disk, or whether it's just an in-memory, change, and it affects the template that gets written, but not the value stored in the Federation API server. What do people think?
I think I understand the question,
Yeah.
but I don't have an opinion on it yet.
Yeah, I think arguably that's an implementation detail. It's, whoever implements the various pieces of this pipeline can decide whether they want to, store them in etcd or propagate them some other way between the stages, or make the stages all part of one process that just passes the information internally. My sense is that because this is kind of an anti-entropy based thing, this cycle of running things through this pipeline is going to potentially happen periodically or quite often, or whenever the necessary states in the clusters change. And so we don't want to introduce like huge overhead in that every time you want to check whether the state in the cluster is what it should be, you've got to like run this thing that's stored in etcd through 5 stages, and each stage persists its piece to etcd, and then the end result gets compared with what's in the cluster.
I'm not sure that's a danger. I mean, using, informers and in-memory state is more likely. So you'd compose, all the different pieces, and you would only have to recompute when something changed in one of the watched resources. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm not, like, it definitely introduces some more layers, at least as proposed, to the existing model. But in terms of like the existing controllers, they watch the resources and hold them in a local store. And then as they're like watching for changes, when something changes, they're referring to the store, and the store gets updated by an informer. I think that model is likely to be consistent with what we would implement for this as well.
Yeah, but it's possible because of the way that, because all of these 5 things are all inside the same process, so they just have an in-memory store. So I guess we'd potentially have to externalize that somewhere. If you, in your original plan, you had this idea of these things being separate processes potentially, or separate containers, the one doing the placement, the one doing the overrides, the one doing the propagation, if I understood you correctly. And then how do those like pass stuff between them, I guess was the question. But maybe I misunderstood your propagation. I mean,
No, I think your concern is warranted, because when I've considered like, how does that work? How do you make these things composable in a way that's useful? It adds a lot of complication. And I think if behavior is going to vary, it's more likely that they have to be like compiled in plugins. And you can vary the behavior, but it's more like it's like a config option that you set to vary the behavior. I mean, if someone really cared, I don't know. I'm saying this, Paul's wanted to keep things as separate as possible, which, to not preclude a user from implementing any one of these pieces on their own, because they have, a specific use case that requires specialized behavior for placement or overrides or whatever. But it's not clear to me how to do that cleanly.
okay. So where did we get to? Irfan, did you want to talk about propagation?
Yeah, before that, I just wanted to, because I did not get a clear concluded idea about what we were talking about, the problem. Let's take a concrete example and take 5 more minutes. And maybe it overlaps, this example overlaps with the policy discussion that we might have on Monday. So say an external policy engine is integrated. And Torin, correct me if I'm wrong somewhere. And the sequence of or the flow is such that an object is created, a federated object is created, then a placement object is created, which specifies that some portion or half of that object or the same object goes into cluster 1 and cluster 2 both. And at the beginning, there is some policy applied, which depends on a property on cluster 1. For example, it is PCI compliant. And based on that policy, the placement that is decided is everything goes to cluster 1. At a later point of time, this property of clusters change. A policy engine or an external entity gets to know about this. So it creates a new placement object or updates the same object, or how does it even get to know that there is an object of a different name, which is a placement object, which is relevant to this particular federated object. I think this is what maybe Torin was trying to point at. And the same thing could be applied to when the interaction between scheduling and placement happen, because scheduling some decision might affect the placement also, right? So how exactly or at what point these interactions happen? Or we maybe don't, we say that we don't really need to flesh out these details as of now. Maybe implementation of controllers or whenever that is implemented, we can talk about that at that point of time.
I think given the time we have left and how detailed we're going to have to get into to, I think, solve that, I'd like to defer the discussion about like how policy interacts with this until Monday. I do think your concern is warranted. I'm still, like I said, I'm still unsure, like if you're going to apply policy to placement, how do you do it if there's no one authoritative place to do it for a given resource? That's the problem we need to solve, I think.
Mm-hmm.
To your question about whether scheduling would have the same problem, I wasn't anticipating, at least until now, that scheduling would involve placement. And maybe you could elaborate as to why that would be the case, because I'm not sure it is today. Is that the feature?
Taking the example of, say, replica set itself. So if scheduling preference on a replica set is changed such, like initially it was updated as 50-50 or 1:1 in two clusters. Later it is updated by the user as 0:1. So, or the weight is changed as 0:1, whichever way. So one cluster now does not get the replica set object at all. So I think that will be governed by placement rather than the scheduling, correct?
I'm not sure it would have to. I mean, it would depend on the propagation mechanism. If it would implicitly treat a zero replica count as do not propagate, like if the cluster was not selected, or whether it would continue to propagate with a zero replica count. What does it do today? I mean, if the scheduler decides that a given cluster is 0 replicas, it still propagates it, or does it not propagate it?
If it's the first time that's happening, then it doesn't propagate, but there's a little, I don't know, call it stupid or whatever, or maybe some reason which I don't clearly have it in my mind. So if a condition like this happens, that a particular cluster should get 0 resources, the replica set remains there with zero replicas.
So I'm assuming, anyway, it could be a problem, but I'm thinking we could also work around it by just making scheduling decisions purely about overrides and just make sure the propagator has the expected behavior if there's a 0 count.
Okay. No, I was also trying to just point at the similar stuff that let's try to keep for example, in the why I am raising this is because in the document, in the example, there's a possibility of multiple placement directives, so multiple placement resources for the same object. And if that happens, then you can also say the same thing for other resources. Probably not for overrides, probably only for scheduling directives or that way. So let's try to keep it simple, is what I was trying to point out.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily explicit, but where there's a selector, then you have the possibility of multiple resources applying, or multiple placement applying, because it's using selectors to find the resources. Where there's like an object reference, then I think it's more designed to be a
that seems more logical for a start, really, rather than a selector.
And I mean, to me, a one-to-one relationship implies something that could be folded in, if it makes sense, into the base object, because there's not going to be this one-to-many relationship to have to deal with.
Okay. Yeah, let's move ahead.
So at the beginning of the meeting, I was asking whether we could actually start building some stuff here. Either start putting specific API proposals forward and start implementing them, or take the existing stuff we have and convert it to something more in line with this, carve off some pieces from that task, if that makes sense. Are we in a place where people can start either writing design documents that we approve and move forward with? Not brainstorming kind of ideas, but more like here's a concrete proposal for what federated replica sets look like, or at least the first half of them.
I think we already had, I did try to initiate something like this, and collectively, Paul also suggested the same thing, and rest of the people also. We thought that we'll probably iterate for the API. We'll iterate in terms of code. At some location, it might be the current repo, or it might be somewhere else. What we can do right now is maybe, depending on who all are willing to or ready to contribute, we can partition, okay, this API can be implemented here and are different, for example, deployment, as you said, replica set as a start or something. Maru already mentioned that he's trying to do something for namespaces, secrets, and correct me, Maru, if I'm wrong, and replica set probably as a prototype, or just to show the current concepts somewhere, right?
So I've started work on, like, my goal is to have secrets and config map and replica set. Just secrets and config maps because they're kind of unusual, and replica set because it's an example of a scheduling or scheduled resource. So I have an API server. I have the API types kind of mirroring what we have in this document. I think the next step for me is just getting cluster registry integrated so we can actually like run an integration test with everything combined, because this, what I'm sort of anticipating in an aggregated model is that we would actually be aggregating with a Kube API. So we're not going to be deploying the API as a totally separate endpoint. It's actually going to be deployed with Kube, with cluster registry, and therefore it's only going to be additive. Things like namespaces and secrets and RBAC come from Kube, and then the federated resources, like a federated resource would live in a Kube namespace. And so you kind of have this, anyway, so the technical details of getting that working and also like putting it up for people to play with, that's sort of my goal, is to have something concrete that people could actually use. And the first step is just getting the ability to get an aggregated set of servers together. And then the secondary step is actually getting propagation working, probably cribbing like the existing controllers, so that it's not only defining what you want replicated, but actually seeing the results of it. Because potentially, if you're something that I've been kind of trying to wrap my head around, because for some reason it really rubs me in a weird way, is if I have a namespace, you know, my app, and I have a replica set, like federated replica set, you know, my replica set, and I'm replicating to the same cluster that I'm aggregated to, then it's actually going to create a replica set in that same namespace. But it's going to be federated replica set, it's just a template, and then a replica set that actually is running pods, which is different from the existing scenario where you'd be running, if you were running the federated API on a given cluster and joining that same cluster, you'd be two totally distinct APIs. You would see a federated replica set on one side, and you'd see a replica set that gets propagated in the host cluster, but it wouldn't be like all commingled. So this is the model suggested by like having a, you know, specific federated types, like unless we want to, you know, re-implement namespaces as well. But my goal is to get that sort of as a working prototype that people can play with, sort of to think about, like, does this make sense? Is this going to be a good user experience, or do we have to consider some other possibility of like actually having a totally separate endpoint that has its own primary cube objects? Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm going after the weeds as usual.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I did spend some cycles or time to see the current federated API, if we have to maybe modify that and pull out the cluster object and then integrate cluster registry with it, what we might need to do. I don't have concrete stuff yet, but if that seems like the right direction, I can maybe try to do that.
I think it's worth exploring regardless. I mean, I think my desire right now is to have as many different avenues explored as possible, while exploration is cheap because we haven't set anything in stone. And hopefully that can inform more concrete decisions that like are harder to change in the future.
Yeah, I think the only caveat to that is I think we need something we need to start releasing stuff in a couple of months. We need to start making progress towards a defined endpoint as opposed to still be experimenting in 3 months' time. So I think as long as we have some kind of time box on the experimentation phase.
No, that's fair. I'm not doing this because I just want to experiment endlessly. I'm doing it because I want to make good decisions about what we end up delivering.
And we can also like start on a concrete implementation now, and then others and ourselves can continue to experiment in parallel.
Okay.
All right, cool. See you Monday, I guess.
Okay, Irfan, I'll follow up with you after this on Slack, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks all.
Bye-bye.